Hello and welcome everybody to ICMDA webinars. I'm Dr. Peter Saunders, the Chief Executive of the International Christian Medical and Dental Association, which brings together about 60,000 Christian doctors and dentists in 107 affiliated national movements worldwide. And today on ICMDA webinars, we're privileged to have back Professor John Patrick, who is going to speak to us on the issue of morality and ethics in today's world. So it's my real pleasure to introduce John. John is a Canadian lecturer on medical ethics, faith and public policy, and a dear friend I've known for many years. He's currently the president and the professor of the history of science, medicine, faith at Augustine College in Canada. And ethics is pretty new to doctors in the sense that it was only really introduced to the medical curricula around the world in about the 1980s. And the university presumed with patent absurdity, John would say, that all our problems are due to ignorance rather than to problems in morality. But in fact, the Hippocratic physicians at the time of the Greek Empire knew that many practitioners were charlatans. And so they recognized the importance of a right fear of judgment after death, that there were things that the patients wanted to be told what they ought to do, not just physical facts, that it was wrong for doctors to actively end people's lives and that physicians have rights of conscience. And John's going to unpack this and much more for us over the next half hour. John, just such a pleasure to have you back here. And we really look forward to hearing what you have to say and to engaging with you in discussion afterwards. Over to you, brother. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's pray. Father, we know that only as your Spirit works in our hearts and minds and imaginations can anything worthwhile happen. So we ask for that Spirit now, that we may be built into the image of our Master and therefore be salt and light in the world. Amen. Well, when I said yes to this, I looked at the title and realized it's an utterly impossible task to do in half an hour. So this is very much an overview. If you want more of what I have a website that ought to be called The Wandering Mind. It goes up and down rabbit holes through regular monotony, but you'll find more material along these lines. When I went to medical school in the 1950s, everybody knew that we were supposed to be gentlemen and we didn't cheat, etc. And there was no teaching whatsoever about ethics. We had some social medicine, which was basically how to keep out of the hands of lawyers. That was the world we lived in, because we had an inherited world. And I think one of the things we need to get our heads around a bit more as evangelical Christians largely listening to this, not entirely, I know, is that when you get converted, you don't become good. That's the process that conversion opens up. So many Christians, it seems to me, are like somebody going to the sports game and leaving after the national anthem. Yeah, they've been there, but they never got involved. I didn't get involved properly myself until I was in my 40s, so I speak from experience at that level. As Peter said, ethics courses didn't appear in medicine until the 80s, which was about the time that I started to come more awake to the realities of what it should mean to be a Christian. I wish someone had preached a sermon earlier on in my life on the text, "Go and tell what I have done for you." That's it. If we're not saying anything about what God has done in our lives, then we're not disciples, we're mere believers. And that's to miss out on life. So I've got a lot to get through in a very short time. You have got the lists of things that I've said I will try and touch on. So the second point on that list is that an anecdote, because it was the beginning of my real interaction with ethics. When our medical school in Ottawa started an ethics course, shortly afterwards, I was at a cocktail party and the dean was there and we got chatting. And in my usual friendly fashion, I said, do you really think that your ethics course will make your students into more ethical doctors? And he said, of course it will. I said, I don't think so. They may become amateur ethicists, but that won't mean that they're ethical. I'm probably the only member of your faculty who has lunch every week with a philosopher, sometimes more than one. And I know a little about the gentleman from philosophy that you have asked to coordinate this course. And he says, I only teach ethics, I don't practice them. And he's perfectly good at teaching them. He knows what people have said and when they said it and why they said it and how they justified it. But he wasn't ethical himself. A few years later, he left the university in rather a hurry for his misbehavior with his graduate students. He still came back later on the committee set up by a higher authority to see whether our program was good enough. That's the world we live in, where it's all perception and no content. The problem can even be traced right the way back to Aristotle, of course, who had no real transcendent God in his world. So he said, every rational activity aims at some end or good. Now, he does say end or good, and the ends can sometimes be anything but good. Rationality doesn't do the job. And to that degree, it fails. So Paul gives us, in one line, the problem. The good that I would not. The good that I would, I do not do. And the evil that I would not, that I do. Who will deliver me from this body of flesh? Romans 7. I don't think that's a pre-conversion experience. If it is, I'm not converted. We still struggle in similar areas throughout our lives. And the only thing, as far as I can see, that we do with those struggles is to share them. And that's safe because there's no pride in talking about your worst screw-ups. But when Christ died for our sins, his sins came into his purview. He owns them. He can ask you to let him use them for what he understands to be some good end. Now, the university, Peter's already used this phrase, presumes with patent absurdity that all our problems are rational and all we need is are solved by rationality and all we need is knowledge. And that's so wrong. I remember the moment many years ago when my best friend in the University of Philosopher, Graham Hunter, who you may have come across, writes very good biographies. The last one was of Pascal. And he says it was me, and I think it was him. But we both agree that around the same time, in the early 80s, we came across 4 lines from Bernard of Clairvaux in the 12th century. And they are these. He says, some seek knowledge for the sake of knowledge. That is curiosity. Well, I'd done that for a long while. I was primarily an academic physician, and for quite a long while did no teaching at all, only research. I had the best job in the world at that point. That's knowledge for the sake of knowledge. I usually say I played with very expensive Lego and then persuaded the people with money to give me some new ones when I was tired of the ones I'd got. But that's just curiosity, says Bernard. The second one is much more difficult. He said, some seek knowledge in order that they themselves may be known. And that, says Bernard, is vanity. From that day forward, I would refer to my CV as my curriculum vanitas. I love doing that in Ivy League universities where it really gets up their nose to have their curriculum vitae described as vanity. But that's what it is. And then he goes on to the next step, which makes it worse still. He says, some seek knowledge in order to sell it. That is dishonorable. It's quite a thought, isn't it? And I've certainly done it, and I suspect many of you have. Our world is built upon selling knowledge, isn't it? Bernard thought it shouldn't be, but he was he did live in the 12th century. Obviously, if you couldn't sell knowledge, there'd be no universities. You've got to pay the bills, but we can exploit it too, and I've done that as well. And that, says Bernard, is dishonourable, and it is. And then the fourth one stopped both of us in our tracks. Some seek knowledge in order to edify others, and that is love. I wasn't guilty of that. I didn't have to do a lot of teaching, but I did have to do some, and I had my own course in fourth year honours biochemistry with students who hadn't seen a mark under 85% for years, so they had real intelligence but no education. I never even bothered to learn their names. But the first objective of my first 2 lectures was to get the class down to about 20, because I didn't want to mark more than 20 papers. And I could do that quite well. And then I enjoyed the course after that. And so did the students in most cases. You don't get many comments years later, but I've had comments about that course, basically along the lines, I never knew you could think about things in that way. They had been in a memorize and dump process, which we still use. I mean, medical education, I think, should be entirely based on an apprenticeship program, but that's an entirely different lecture, and I mustn't get on that track. So, no, rationality will not take us to good conclusions. If what we want is money, rationality is not going to take us to ethics at all. And that's where many people are. And as Peter pointed out, the Hippocratic physicians understood this. I first talked about these over 25 years ago and was astonished not long ago to find that lecture is still on YouTube. And every now and again, I get comments about it. Usually years later and along the lines, I heard the lecture, but I didn't understand until now. And then something happened in their medical life that brought it back, and they're kind enough to write and say thank you. And I've got to move on to this very quickly. So if you want to know more about the Hippocratic physicians, I'll give you a very quick 4-point outline of what they did, and then you can go and look it up. You'll find it on my website, and you'll find it on YouTube if you want to. So the opening of the oath is an oath, but it's made to the pagan gods and goddesses. I vow to Apollo, Hygeia, Panacea, and Asclepius, and all the gods and goddesses. Now, they wouldn't work for us. But what clearly these wise guys on the island of Kos understood was that if you don't fear judgment after death, the patient has a problem. And we're seeing this big time with the growth of physician-assisted suicide, or physician-assisted death, I prefer, because that becomes, or medical assistance at death, and then that's really mad. They had very little in the way of effective treatments. It's an interesting fact that it wasn't until the 1860s that going to the doctor correlated with living longer. And so why did people go to see the doctor? Because they were good clinicians. They've seen disease. And when you're sick, you want to know what it is. You desperately want to know what it is. You hand yourself over to a physician. And they could tell them what it is. You're going to be all right. There's a lot of it going around. Or, I'm sorry, but you better get your affairs in order because this is a death sentence. Not so bluntly put. But that was why people went. And so these physicians understood that you needed to trust your doctor. And trust is decaying rapidly. But the first thing they could do is say, we will not kill under any circumstances. And we ought to have said that the one thing physicians should not do is kill. It should be entirely separate. That's why abortion, I think, should be outside the medical system for anything other than health reasons. And the same with killing people. If you're an atheistic rationalist, the last thing you can do to assert yourself is to decide when to die. It's perfectly rational given their starting premise, but it's not for you and me. So what patients come for is for you to help them to decide what they ought to do. Now, ought is not a word that can be derived from physical facts. If you don't believe me, read Peter Kraft, and better still, if you've got the energy, read The Abolition of Man. Struggle through the first chapter till the end, where he has an absolutely brilliant piece of Lewis, where he says this: for the wise men of old, the cardinal problem of human life was how to conform your soul to objective reality. Objective reality? Yes, they believed in it because it's real. And the solution was wisdom, self-discipline. For the modern man, the cardinal problem of human life is how to conform reality to our desires, and the solution is technique. That's shatteringly true. And he goes on in The Abolition of Man to develop that. So patients want a doctor who will tell them what they ought to do and who has moral integrity. That means they must grant rights of conscience to the physician. Because if you undermine his moral integrity, he's far less use to you. So, where do we get our morals from? They are not derivable from pure rational thought without a premise that is not objective in the modern sense, but objective in the ancient sense. And I need to fill in a little bit of that background for you. You've got a lot of reading if you haven't done anything in this area. But it's very interesting. When Adam and Eve were sent out of the garden, God didn't give them much in the way of ethical instruction, did he? Adam, you've got to work. Eve, you're going to have babies. He could do that because he had formed us in his image, which I take to be the knowing of good and evil. They had eaten that fruit. That was their turning point. But it did make us different from the animals, who they are a bundle of instincts and training, reflexes. We're not. Lewis in Mere Christianity opens with two children talking to one another, and one says to the other, I gave you some of my chocolate, you ought to give me some of your orange. But Lewis points out, you never hear the other child say, I don't accept your value system. We're hardwired. We know that some things are right and some are wrong. The last election in the States had got a lot of that going on as a subtext which was hardly touched. But of course, they get out of the garden, the first thing humans do to one another is murder one another. And God lets it go on with them learning about moral consequence until it gets so bad he wipes them out in the flood. And Noah starts off in the same way immediately afterwards. But it's a long, long while before we get to the Ten Commandments, which are the heart of the Western tradition, whether anyone likes it or not, especially the wonderful piece of genius coming from Alfred and his sons called Common Law, about which I could go on to the next hour, but mustn't. Polanyi is probably another place to go with Lewis. But read him in Leslie Newbegin's Foolishness to the Greeks. He was as far as I can find out, an unbelieving Jew in Hungary who was a brilliant chemist. And as a young man, he wrote to Einstein and they had a correspondence, so he really was brilliant. But when in 1917 the communist world appeared, he knew it was going to wreck Hungary too. And he went to Russia to a conference and ended up talking to the Soviet Minister of Science, whose name I've forgotten at the moment, and asked him what Soviet science would look like. And of course, he got the Marxist answer: the proletariat will tell the scientists what to do. Well, that's a recipe for technology, but it's not a recipe for science. In science, you're intrigued by things, and it is not a purely rational process at all. All sorts of things feed into it. And if you read anything about how people understood major steps forward, I mean, the famous Einstein having a conversation with a friend at lunchtime, and suddenly the friend said something which Einstein couldn't nailed down afterwards, but he knew how important it was. And he said, sorry, I've got to stop. And he went back to his office, and that was the beginning of those famous papers. It was a flash of insight. And that happens time and time again. And Christians can expect that. The secularists can't. What do these scientists have in common? Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, Newton, Boyle, Faraday, Clerk Maxwell, Eddington. Well, they're all Christian. We don't need to be ashamed of Christianity. We need to learn how to tell the stories as they happen. If you haven't read Arthur Leff, Duke Law Review, 1979, Leff on Justice, read it and then send it to anybody in the legal system that you know. Because Leff was another of these people who intuitively knew that something was going wrong, but he didn't know how to deal with it. And so he gave a lecture, which is what professors do. When we don't understand something, we give a lecture on it, and then at the end of it, we know more, although the students are probably totally confused. Leff taught common law at Yale, but the lecture was given at Duke. And it begins like this. He says, I want to believe, and so do you, in a complete immanent, not imminent next week, but immanent, accessible to your mind, and transcendent set of propositions about right and wrong, findable rules that direct us as to how to live our lives righteously. We all need that. He, I think, was an unbelieving Jew again. So it was Torah he was talking about. But then he goes on. He's living in the 1970s, he says, and he didn't trust his students as much as he used to. A recurrent theme in the literature, if you want to pursue it. And he says, but I also want to believe, and so do you, in no such thing as a immanent and transcendent set of rules, but rather that we are wholly free to decide for ourselves what we ought to do and what we ought to be. What we want, heaven help us, is to be simultaneously perfectly ruled and perfectly free. Nobody can do that. He then writes 20 pages of lucid prose and comes to his conclusion, which is wrong. It's the age of social Darwinianism, particularly in America. You can't knock Darwin. So he says, it looks to me as though we are all that we have. In other words, Darwin's right. We are where we are. We've got to go on from there. But he's honest. He says, looking around the world, this is an extraordinarily unappetizing prospect. If brotherly love exists, the ruling model is Cain and Abel. Only if the law was unnatural would it be unspeakable and unchallengeable. But as things stand now, everything is up for grabs. The law has become the pursuit of power, not the pursuit of justice. Now, he can't live with this conclusion, so he writes a little addendum, which ought to have changed the structure of the paper. He says, nevertheless, starving the poor is wicked, buying and selling each other is depraved, napalming babies is wicked. There is in this world such a thing as objective evil. He didn't put the objective bit in. He was right. He ought to have gone back to that the previous paragraph, and said, because we all do know that there is evil in the world, that there are bad things in the world, and yet we want to believe it could be otherwise, which doesn't come from Darwin. It requires transcendence. It's interesting, isn't it? I spent most of my clinical life with children the modern liberal wants to kill before they're born. But have you ever thought of the fact that suffering, which everybody has to go through at some level, can only be understood if there is more to this life? It cannot be understood from within the story where we are at the moment. You can write long books about it, but they're not satisfying. And it's not the way it works when you handle it well. There's one mother said to me, she had 3 children die of cystic fibrosis. She didn't have a normal child. She said, if God had told me what I was going to go through, I would have said, I can't do it. But it's all right. Not because she understands it, but because she knows that God is at work. And we have to bear witness to that. And we have to be a bit more aggressive, not to argue that our way is right, but to argue that in a democratic system, you must make space for people as numbers warrant. And you must recognize that doctors require moral integrity because patients want them to have it. That means, I think, that we invented the medical system, and now it's been taken over by liberals, and of course they're destroying it. We need to take our area of it back, and it will work much better than anyone else's. That's going to increase steadily. So talk about the way we should organize a medical system that is fair as numbers warrant, not as liberals decide it's important. They are trapped in the unintended disaster of reductionism, which leads to scientism. Now, this is another thing that needs a lecture in its own right. So I can only set you off, and you can explore other people as well. The history of science, the best place to read this, I think, is Rodney Stark's book. He was a sociologist of science, amongst other things, and was brought to faith by recognizing that without transcendence, he couldn't make sense of what happened. Medicine only happened in the Judeo-Christian world. It's the only place where it happened as we know it. Everywhere there have been people who knew something about what was going on, whether they be witch doctors or natural healers or whatever. But only in the Western world did it take off in the dramatic way that it did. But what made it possible also created a problem. What made it possible, I think, began in the 13th century, but essentially it was the banning of deductive logic in the University of Paris in 1277, which forced teachers to use inductive reasoning. You note how allergic the liberal elite are to saying that science is inductive reasoning. They desperately need it not to be, because they know if it truly is inductive reasoning, which of course it is, then you start from what you can see, and only if you believe that underneath there is a creator who is orderly himself, is there any point in going on. If you lived in Africa up until the very recent past, and still to a great extent, if a measles epidemic came through, it appeared to be random. Life was not easy. Many of your children died, your crops failed at random, your governments were awful. No, not much evidence of a God of love. But the love that came with Christ was love in the Spirit. It wasn't a feeling. It was an objective pressure in our lives to live differently, guided by the Spirit. And so when in the University of Paris, of course, Catholic university, all the early universities were, banned deductive reasoning, they had to do inductive. And that led to experiments. It took 70 years or so before we have the first accounts of real experiments in Merton College, Oxford. But one of the people watching, another Franciscan, was William of Ockham. You've heard of Occam's razor, which is OCCAM for some reason, although William of Ockham was OCKHAM, William from Ockham, which is a village. But he was a smart man, and he realized that if these experiments worked, they might undermine the authority of the church. So he tried to help God out, which you should never do, because God can do better on his own. He knows what he's about. But what Ockham did was to pull apart things that can be measured from things that can't. And to cut a long story short, because I'm running out of time very rapidly, in fact, I've run out of time already, I think, that transmitted itself through France and back into England to Bacon, who said, collect facts, and he meant things that could be measured. And in 100 years of Newton, Laplace says to Napoleon when asked where God fits into his physics, he said, I don't need God for physics anymore. And that's true. If you want to do just applied consequences of where you've got to, you can do it without any belief. But you couldn't have started it without that belief. And that's where we lost our way. So we saw it in the COVID thing. The science is in. If you do science, the one thing you know for certain, it's never in. There's always things you've missed, always things you have to go, always something more to do. I can't do everything else on my list because you'll have to pick up Robert Frost. It's a lovely piece, but I just haven't got time for it. One of the people you should also put on your list for summer reading, ideally, would be David Stove's book, Darwinian Fairy Tales. I always collect atheists who speak the truth. He's one such. And he committed suicide when he found he got cancer, which is perfectly rational if you believe there's nothing after this life. But he was also very committed to logical, clear thought. And he said, there is no way that Darwin can give us morality. Hence, the book Darwinian Fairy Tales really tears apart the social Darwinianism rubbish that was going on. And if you do get the book, do read the introduction. It's hilarious and very true. So, what else can we say about morality in medicine? Well, the last point is a very important one to think about. And if you want to follow it up, read O'Donovan's Gifford Lectures on what was it called? The End of Ethics or something like that. That's not what it was, but it was something like that. But in it, he points out something, and I said, oh, why didn't I see that before? I'd been almost there all the while. He points out that there are two ways of looking at ethics. You can do it rationally or you can do it reasonably. Most of us, for most of the time, have a reasonable view of ethics, not a rational one, not one starting from a distant first premise and getting to the current problem. I grew up in working-class Birmingham. I was the second person on the street where I grew up to go to university and the first one to become a doctor in a street of 400 houses. But we didn't lock our doors. People settled their arguments and they would come to reasonable conclusions. Well, yeah, I suppose I was wrong. Meaning that isn't the way we behave in this society. We had rules that were inculturated. They can be traced back to the Ten Commandments. And of course, when I went to school, the Bible was read every day in school, so the story seeped in. Now the story has gone, and we are surprised. As Lewis puts it rather bluntly, we castrate and bid the gelding be fruitful. We cut off the source of moral reality and pretend that we can get on without it. And O'Donovan, the book is hard to read, so read the first chapter, the last chapter first, and you'll want to understand what goes before it. O'Donovan is the only author who I really love reading, but one of his books I've had for 20 years and I haven't finished it yet, that I keep going back to the beginning and I stop at a certain point and get a little further every time. But talk about what your patients would think was reasonable rather than starting to work out ethics on the Georgetown mantra, autonomy, justice, beneficence and non-maleficence. I have yet to find a student who can answer the question, are those goods ordered? And in which case, which are the most fundamental? They always put autonomy, almost always autonomy, now social justice, both of which are dependent upon the others. The 10 Commandments, the 10 divine intolerances, the things that thou shalt not do. And when those are firmly in place, you can extrapolate to the good. You can begin to see in the distance what good may look like. Only when those are in place, as Leff understood, is justice a real possibility. And only when those three are accepted is autonomy safe. The modern student thinks that freedom is the freedom to do what they wish. The Christian view of freedom is the power to do what you ought. That's not me, that's Lord Acton. Freedom, the power to do what you ought. Thank you, because I want to get to the questions. I hope Peter hasn't been bored stiff and he's gone away, but we'll see.
Thanks very much, John. No, I'm still very much here, and we've got a time of Q&A now. John, I wanted first to come back to this whole idea of that you can't get an ought from an is. You know, it's
Yes.
you need a moral framework, not just facts. And would you like to unpack a bit more how people who do not have a belief in transcendence or a belief in God and absolute morality, how they get to ethics at all? You've touched on Beecham Childress's what they call the Georgetown mantra, beneficence, non-maleficence, autonomy, and justice. But they're scrabbling around in the dark. So how do atheists or secularists derive a code of ethics? And
they cheat.
What does it have?
They're parasitic. They want what they can't derive from their understanding. So they just do it autocratically. So you've always got to find an example where you can nail them down. Now, I would do it with students thus, and you can find other examples the same way. My office was somewhat chaotic. I knew where things were, but it didn't look as though I did. And the door was always open. So I could come back and find a student waiting to see me. And if I was in the mood, I'd say, "Oh, the exam was on my desk. Did you read it?" And they would be insulted. If I knew they didn't believe, you see, and I'd say, well, a good Darwinian would have read it, wouldn't he? Because if it's all about the battle of the genes and getting the best you can with what you've got, you had an opportunity to win and you didn't take it. Any Darwinian would have taken it. Now, no Darwinian can argue that that's not true. And so you have to ask God. I mean, I found over the years when I'm in a difficult situation, help is a prayer that's always answered. And some brilliant response emerges, for which you know you're not responsible.
You're saying that the atheist doesn't act consistently with his own belief in Darwinism.
That's right. They're incoherent.
He would cheat, but he selectively cherry picks his ethics from Christianity and takes some of them, like justice, vaguely defined, but ignores other parts of the Ten Commandments that are less palatable. Can I just come back also to your quote that that ethics, Rodney Stark, I think it was, that medicine could only happen in the Judeo-Christian world.
Yeah.
Why? I'm sure some people would want to dispute that historically.
They will, yes.
What about the Muslims and so on? But the Judeo-Christian world, could you unpack that a bit more? Why?
Yes, surely. I take more flack for that than anything else. But again, you've got to find the examples to push them back. I've only ever once spoken at the Oregon Medical School, but I'm told that lecture became sort of urban myth and is still talked about. And it's about this issue. Foolishly, perhaps, I chose one of the most liberal medical schools on the continent to give a lecture on why multiculturalism is not a basis for medicine. I began by asking them to raise their hands as to who believe we have to become multicultural in medicine. And almost all of them raised their hands there. And I said, well, I think I can prove you're wrong. All I have to do, since we're doctors, we learn most by patients, is tell you about one patient. I saw a little girl who had a badly neglected septic arthritis. And pus had got to the tibia and the femur. And she was septicemic and dying. And this was in Africa. And I said to the parents, the only thing that can be done is to cut off her leg. Actually, it wasn't me that said it. It was the missionary doctor there. And fill her with antibiotics. But that will take 20 minutes. And in those 20 minutes, the parents left with the child. Now, I'd been teaching the nurses and I said to them, I'm upset, but you're not. Can we talk? And the prayer help was there, and the question that came up was, if this had been a little boy, what would they have done? And the answer was they would have done the amputation. And I said, why would you treat little boys and little girls differently? And they said, in our culture, it's a woman's job to till the fields, fetch the food, get the water, and bear the children. A woman with one leg will have a life not worth living. Does that sound vaguely familiar? But if you're multicultural, you must accept that view of the relative value of little boys and little girls as being just as good as yours. There's no better. Now, none of you believe that. So ditch your hypothesis and start thinking again. Now, the only Muslim who tried to do experiments had to feign madness to stay alive because the sheikh wanted his mind to solve a problem which was beyond him. So he remained mad until the sheikh died. But nobody else. He got very close to a proper description of the visual response, but he wasn't encouraged. Whereas in our culture, once the teaching of logic reappeared in the 12th century, we took off like a rocket because it fitted with ours. We are a Judeo-Christian culture, whether we like it or not. That's what made us, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. It's wonderful to see modern intellectuals who are moving in that direction. I mean, Neil Ferguson is the last one to say we can't do without Jesus. I go to church now, I'm a Christian. Not like Dawkins, who says I'm a cultural Christian. Go on Unheard and listen to Ayaan Hirsi Ali and what's his name, who wrote Dominion, the historian. There are a lot of them. They're the thoughtful people who are now at least saying, I'm not going to criticize Christianity as I used to, and many of them turning to faith. So that's the way we go. Cultures are different, not equal. Equal is not a word to use. Difference is the word to use and to think about it. Those of you coming from other cultures know that. I mean, when the first time I went to India, one guy there said, you Christians think your missionaries didn't achieve very much, but you did because you destroyed karma. Medicine, if karma is true, is being unkind to the people who are sick because they're sick because of their behavior. If they endure their sickness, they come back in the next life better. Karma and medicine are not compatible if you really believe it. And so it goes on. Cultures are different. Mangalwadi is well worth reading if you want to follow up the Indian position. He's amazing.
Yeah, so that Vishal Mangalwadi, the book that made your world.
That's right.
So he's an Indian Christian academic, beautiful dissection of Western culture. I wonder if we can come back, John. I mean, you mentioned Neil Ferguson, the historian, who wrote The Empire and Civilization, and his wife, who is a Somalian Muslim, who's both of them have become Christians very recently, and also Tom Holland, you mentioned, who wrote Dominion, not far away. You get other people like Jordan Peterson lecturing on the Sermon on the Mount and quoting the Old Testament creation narratives and so on.
Yeah.
What's happening? Why are we seeing seemingly an increasing number of academics from a whole host of different disciplines, but from secular worldview backgrounds, turning to Christianity and, if not being converted, at least not hostile to it and welcome?
That's right.
Why are we seeing this, do you think?
It's interesting, isn't it? Physics, quantum and cosmology and molecular biology are the best things to study if you want to remain Christian. So I think you won't find a molecular biologist who wants to argue about the beginning anymore. And currently, James Tour is really pulling the noses of the people who have been doing origin of life research, saying it can't be done. If you want an introduction to that very quickly, just put apologetics, Dallas, Stephen Meyer, and James Tour. James Tour in particular does a brilliant hour in which he begins by saying, this is a Christian apologetics conference, but I'm not going to mention God in the next hour. I'm going to show you what he's done and let him speak for himself. If you think the idea of getting an evolved DNA is unlikely, getting from inorganic to organic is more unlikely. They are both way beyond the point where it's a very low probability. It is zero in both cases. So that really pushes back very strong. And the amount of cheating that's going on in the literature, which was a very tiny problem when I was young, now it's huge. You have no idea whether what you're reading is true unless you have some real insight into the methods. And evidence-based medicine is not evidence-based medicine. It's authority-based, as it always was and always will be. I was once capable of evidence-based medicine for about 0.1001% of the literature because I'd written it. I knew that bit, and I knew when people were using the method that Philip Hilton and I had put together and were washing the data before they did it, before they published, because we knew what the error bars should
come
look
back
like.
to that question. Christian Stykov, who's one of our listeners, is saying, thanks, Dr. Patrick, for this talk. What's your opinion about trust in science, given how we are most often unaware of the morality of researchers? Just comments on that.
Well, science is in deep trouble.
Objectivity of evidence-based medicine.
Yeah. Perhaps the best, another book, Robert Fogel's The Fourth Great Awakening. Around 2000, an act of God propelled me to do grand rounds at the University of Chicago Medical School when I was past my sell-by date as a trendy scientist. So it turned out it really was a God thing. And one of the good things about doing it, rounds there, it's not an hour. They want you for a day or two and they clean you out to see what they can learn from you. But in return, they say, is there anybody in the university you'd like to meet? And I said, well, if you can arrange it, I'd really like to meet Robert Fogel, who was a Nobel Prize winner in economics from the world's most famous department of economics. And he'd written a book called The Fourth Great Awakening, which someone sent to me, and I foolishly didn't write his name in the flyleaf. So if he's listening, please contact me. I'd like to say thank you. He was talking about, he's a secular Jew, writing about the role that conversion and genuine faith has played in America. Because around 2000, he no longer trusted his students in the way that he used to in the world's most famous department. So he wrote the book. And he said, the most important thing you need to create around yourself is a group of people you can trust. And it's hard to do because trust is going down like a stone from a rocket. If you ask a student class, how many of your class could you trust with $1,000 with no paper trail because the People's Republic of Canada is going to take my money away, I'll give it to you and collect it when it's safe again? How many would you trust that with? And it's negligible. Whereas, Peter, you and I could do that, and we wouldn't even think twice about it. That's the gift we have from our upbringing rather than our conversion.
Chris Prenger is asking here, could you briefly connect conscience to morality and ethics? You were arguing Romans 2 argument earlier about how everyone has a sense of right and wrong, even Adam and Eve did when they were thrown in the garden.
Yep. Well,
that was in ethics.
Conscience is vital. If you want to trust your doctor, you must give him rights of conscience. I think that's just a logical consequence. Now, you have to realize that two words are used in Greek for conscience. One is moral feeling, and the other is moral thought. Moral feeling is not reliable. Moral thought is, if you're within a story that makes sense to the world. And the current secular story doesn't make sense to the world. Just look at what's happening to our kids. They can't handle the internet. They're committing suicide, they're self-harming, etc. All sorts of things which were negligible problems when you and I were training are now huge problems. And it's because we've lost the narrative, and conscience flows from the narrative. So this is you hear the voice behind you saying, this is the way, not that. That's conscience. But that's a rational conscience based on Jesus is Lord. We have reasons for behaving well. They don't.
Mm.
And that's why they want outcomes all the while. They want equality of outcome. It can't happen.
Yeah. There's a question on that. In day-to-day practice, one of the attendees says, I have problems with quality outcome frameworks in general practice, as an example, where the ethic of income often takes precedence over the ethic of proper patient care. This has frequently led me into conflict with practice managers. What would you advise?
First of all, I'd give thanks that I'm not in your position. But there is good news coming along. I'm meeting more and more people in the American system anyway, who are bailing out and going for fee for service based on their local church and saying, look, you don't need to sit for 5 hours in Emerge. If you just need a few stitches, I'll come and do it. They don't live rich lives, but they live old-fashioned lives of being the medical insight for their church. And there's lots of things the church should be doing. Power of attorney should be given to the church. No elderly person should go to interact with the health system alone, etc., etc. There are lots of things to do. And you could do them, but you won't have the income you had before, but you'll be a lot more satisfied. But it can be done. And the other thing is, you see, in the American system, and this has now been proved, because we who believe and are living the life are much healthier than the majority of the population. We spend a fraction of the amount of money in our lifetime that they do. And yet, in the American system, the insurance companies are charging you no premium for your behavior, really. But there ought to be. That, again, is something to talk about and to think about, because the biggest problems that people see in certainly in a city medicine is, I asked the question, what proportion of patients you saw this week were primarily coming to you with a behavioral problem? And they'll say 90%.
Yeah.
No, we're no good at behavior, are we? But the Bible is. If you will keep this law, it will go well with you and your children.
Yes, yeah. Deuteronomy 6 and the Jewish education system. Okay, it looks like we've lost John, and we've run out of time anyway. So just to thank you all again for coming today. Thank you for John for his talk. Thank you very much for joining us, and may the Lord bless you. And we look forward to seeing you again soon on ICMDA webinars. Thank you.